Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion today on chemicals and plastics. This is a deep dive discussion into the composition, recyclability, and policy implications related to chemicals and plastics. And please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I see that Gayon has from the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, and we'd encourage all participants, as usual, to introduce yourself and where you come from into the chat so we can make this session as interactive as possible. So my name is Brenda Kukuk. I am the Senior Program Manager with the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee Secretariat that's supporting governments to develop the International Legally Binding Instrument on Plastic Pollution. And I have been working with the Secretariat since it was formed last year. Previous to this, I worked many years in SciChem, so I'm very happy to be back into this space today and support this discussion in the community of practice, and happy to see that the community of practice is still very active and moving. So just to get started, actually first, maybe I'll just pass over to Melanie and to Roland to introduce themselves. I see them, they've introduced themselves in the chat, but maybe just to get started, Roland, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Can do. Yeah, Roland Weber. I'm chemist from Germany. Since 30 years, I'm working mainly on persistent organic pollutants. And since 18 years, I mainly support UN agencies and environmental ministries for implementation of the Stockholm Convention. And since 4 years, coming from the POPs, I have entered the plastic topic. Plastic came into the Basel Convention, and also from Stockholm Convention, we did an assessment. So this is how I came to chemicals and plastic.
Thank you, Roland. Mel?
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Ashton. I'm with the Islands Global Project, which coordinates the Islands Global Program, a GEF-funded program working in 33 small island developing states. It's great to be with you all today. I've been in the chemicals and waste area for a while and was one of the designers of this project, actually, the SciChem activity. So it's nice to be back with you all today and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Brenda.
Great. So Roland and Melanie are our main speakers today, and I will be facilitating today's session. To introduce the community of practice and the Green Forum, today's discussion is the third in a series of discussions in 2023 on issues of concern, chemicals of concern across diverse supply chains, capacity building, and other relevant topics. They are led, of course, by the SciChem Secretariat. The first discussion this year was on integrated chemicals and waste management in the lead up to the 5th session of the international conference, which is coming up in September, focused on national systems, industry actions, and SDG implementation. The second discussion was on best practices for responsible chemicals and waste management in companies and small and medium enterprises. And this, of course, is then the third one. The recording and the discussion summary of both of those discussions are available on the Green Forum, and please access them using the link shared through the chat. To remind you, as Mel and I have both touched on, this community of practice was established in 2020. There were 4 communities of practice established at the time, and they led to many successful knowledge exchanges. And while the 4 groups came to an end in 2022 as part of the GEF project, the SciChem Secretariat is continuing the momentum with a single all-inclusive community of practice on chemicals and waste in partnership with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnerships. And this chemicals and waste management community of practice has been established on the Green Forum to host ongoing active knowledge exchange before, during, and after these discussion sessions. So before taking our deep dive into the more technical aspects on chemicals and plastics, I'm going to present you with a few slides to provide some background to the INC process. I think that the INC process provides some deep relevance to these discussions today. And of course, it's a very exciting time with the negotiation of the legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. So as you know, in these forums, we have a series of poll questions that are put forward. And the first poll question we could start with as we head into the presentation right now is on your familiarity with the INC process itself. So we'd just like to understand that as we get started here. So I'm going to start in on the slides while you answer the poll in front of you, and we'll start that way. So I just wanted to highlight in getting started that June has been a super busy month within UNEP itself on plastics. The very beginning of the month, the INC Secretariat, that I'm a part of, finished the convening of the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting in Paris, and then moving straight into the World Environment Day celebrations on the 5th of June. That's UNEP's flagship day. And the theme of the World Environment Day this year was on solutions to plastic pollution and was, of course, hosted in Cote d'Ivoire. So a lot of momentum out there on plastic pollution, and it's building globally. So I just wanted to highlight that the World Environment Day also had this theme, and there is so much momentum. Next slide. So perfect. I just want to start in a little bit about the INC process. In March 2022, UNEA, of course, United Nations Environment Assembly, adopted Resolution 5/14, which was titled End Plastic Pollution and Towards an International Legally Binding Instrument. So this is just over a year ago, and the resolution called for the development of an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. A few of the key things that were specified is that this agreement could include both binding and voluntary approaches. It should be based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic and takes into account, among other things, the Rio Declaration and national circumstances and capabilities. So very important concepts in this. Next slide, please. So we have a really ambitious timeframe in front of us for negotiating this international instrument. We started our negotiation process late last year in Punta del Este in Uruguay. Then we moved to Paris just at the end of May, early June. Our next milestone will be the government of Kenya hosting INC3 the week of November 13th in UNEP headquarters in Nairobi. Followed by INC4 in Ottawa, Canada in April 2024. And then the last session will be hosted by the Republic of Korea sometime at the end of 2024, where we are expecting to have, or we have been mandated to have agreement on the text of the international instrument by the end of next year. So we have a super ambitious timeframe ahead of us here in this context. Next slide. In terms of Paris, the session took place from May 29th to the 2nd of June. Just to highlight, we had over 1,600 in-person participants. This represented 167 member states of the committee and the European Union. So it's high participation of members. And we had over 370 observers, organizations in the room, and many had several participants. So we had double the amount of observers participating in the session, and we had a strong participation. A few of the key things that happened in Paris were that we were successful in electing vice chairs to our bureau that are guiding our process, including a rapporteur. The rules of procedure, there was an agreement to apply them, the draft rules of procedure provisionally. This took up quite a lengthy period of the INC process itself, but we were able to move into substantive discussions that took place through two contact groups. One was on possible objectives and substantive obligations, and those were the more technical side of things. The other contact group talked about means of implementation and implementation measures. And so those are often linked to aspects that are comparable to other international instruments, et cetera, and how we'll actually implement the treaty itself. A number of thematic side events also took place on related topics. So those were some key aspects of INC2 in Paris. I don't want to touch on a lot, but I want to just go to the next slide and highlight how some of the technical discussions took place in this first contact group. So we had a document, which was document 2/4, which was an options paper for consideration of items, elements of the instrument. And this paper included a set of 12 possible control measures in the future instrument. And I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm just giving a slight introduction here, and Melanie and Roland will be digging into more details. But what I wanted to touch upon is that you can see where chemicals can be considered across these 12 control measures in many, many ways. Not only is chemicals highlighted in obligation number 3 that's listed there, it can be looked at across the whole supply chain, across the whole life cycle. So from design to waste management to human health, etc. So chemicals considerations can be considered rather cross-cutting. And I wanted to show you the way in which the topic was addressed from a technical perspective in our discussions. Next slide. Of course, I touched on that the second contact group also considered implementation aspects. And just to dwell on that for a moment, is means of implementation was looking at things like financial assistance, capacity building, technical assistance, tech transfer on mutually agreed terms, as well as implementation measures such as national action plans, national reporting, compliance, assessment, and monitoring and valuation. Next slide, please. So just to highlight what were the key outcomes of Paris before I finish off here. So the second session determined the mandate for steps towards INC3, our third session, which will be in Kenya in November. So our chair of the process, Ambassador Meza Kudra from Peru, will be preparing a zero draft text of the international instrument for consideration at INC3. This will be guided by views expressed at INC1 and INC2. The range of views he'll be considering in this text can be expressed through options, and the Secretariat, so my team, myself, we will be supporting the chair in developing the zero draft. Other aspects include that members and stakeholders were invited to provide submissions, the observer submissions by the 15th of August, and members, which are the member states, by the 15th of September on elements not discussed at INC2. So these include things like scope and principles, and on any potential areas for intersessional work. And I'm going to touch on that in my very last slide next, but these submissions will be uploaded online. So these areas here, these two contact groups we discussed, came up with two long lists of areas where intersessional work may be required in the lead up to INC3. Unfortunately, the INC did not agree on any specific process in developing any of this intersessional work, but members and observers are invited to make submissions on any of the topics listed here. And you'll see in the first column under contact group 1, there are many aspects linked to chemicals and waste, and I wanted to just highlight them as an introduction here in moving over to Roland. Things like definitions, criteria, you'll see that chemical substances are listed there specifically, but also problematic and avoidable plastic polymers, design, substitutes, and alternatives, which are all also linked to the topic of chemicals. So I wanted to just highlight these as opportunities for you in moving forward of where your work might be relevant and where you may wish to submit submissions to the INC Secretariat in moving forward. So that closes out my specific presentation here to introduce the INC process. And from here, I would like to pass over to make the transition over into the introductory presentation on the deep dive into chemicals. And I'd like to pass over to Roland. Meanwhile, as Roland gets started, I haven't really looked at the chat while I've been talking all this time, so I don't know if the poll question came out or whatnot, but I'll pass over to Roland and moving forward. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks much, Brenda. So over the last 3 years, we have developed for UNEP Chemicals in Plastic report. and I will introduce here in the first presentation to the main findings of the report. You can go to next slide. So it's a technical report which describes the various chemicals related issues of plastic pollution, including chemicals of concern and impacted sectors that use the plastics, the environmental fate and health effects of plastic associated chemicals, problems with the current state of chemical risk assessment. Then also it includes options for addressing chemicals of concern in plastics, especially strategies for substituting problematic chemicals. And then also one chapter about managing existing plastic waste and plastic in the circular economy. Next click. So the report was developed by UNEP in cooperation with the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention and lead authors from the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, and I'm one of the lead authors. So the report is available on UNEP website. Here's the link. And also we have developed a summary and a key finding short report which have been in document at the INC2 meeting Brenda just introduced. Next slide. Yeah, so what is in my plastic? It all starts with monomers like ethylene or styrene. So here you polymerize and get then polystyrene and polyethylene. And then you put additives. So additives bring the desired functionality to the plastic materials. And in average, in a plastic, you have about 4% of additives. But this can go up to 50–60% of additives, like in soft PVC. So here for the additives, main additives are plasticizers, fillers, flame retardants, and colorants, antioxidants, heat and light stabilizers. Then there are other intentionally added substances, for example, the monomers, because polymerization is never full polymerization. So therefore, at the end of production, you also find still some monomers there or some catalysts which were used in the production. And then there are non-intentionally added substances. So this can be solvents during the process, cleaning agents, or impurities from the manufacturing, and very relevant chemicals which come into recycling, for example, flame retardants, and are finally in the recycled materials. Also, they were not intentionally added. Next slide. Overall, the report is an extensive literature review on major aspects of chemicals in plastic. And when you look to the what type of chemicals were used, our assessment, we have published 2 peer-reviewed studies on chemicals in plastic, and the database of both reviews were then combined for the technical report. Yeah. So one is this enabling a circular economy for chemicals in plastic. That's from Orisano, me, and Peter Funke, open access. And then you have the deep dive into plastic monomers, additives and processing aids. That's from Wiesinger, Wang, and Helwig et al. So those 2 review papers we combined then in the list of chemicals, and also this list of chemicals is available on the UNEP website, which you can download as an Excel file. Next slide. So overall, we found that there are 13,000 substances which are associated with plastics, and more than 3,200 are chemicals of potential concern. We have also identified 10 groups of chemicals which are being of specific concern due to their hazardous properties. This includes, for example, halogenated flame retardants or per- and polyfluorinated substances, so-called PFAS, the bisphenols, the phthalates, certain UV stabilizers, but also non-intentional added substances like the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Next slide. There is a strong link between chemicals in plastics and SciChem emerging policy issues. So this includes chemicals in plastics, which are relevant parts of chemicals in products. Yeah, many products contain plastics or are made out of plastics. Then many of the plastic additives of concern are endocrine disrupting chemicals. A range of plastic additives are hazardous substances in the life cycle of electrical and electronic equipment. Around 20% of electrical and electronic equipment is plastics. Then PFASs are chemicals of concern related to plastics, and also at the same time, there are issues of concern under SciChem. And when you look plastic nanoparticles, which are also an issue of concern under SciChem, the manufactured nanoparticles for plastics at the end in the oceans, plastic is what is coming out when the plastic particles degrade. So also there is this link. Next click. So this right report, which I have, this assessment report of issues of concern from 2020, includes several additionally issues of concern which have been identified by the Global Chemical Outlook 2. And also here we have a good link to those issues of concern, which includes bisphenols, phthalates, intentional microplastics, PAHs, and metalloids. So therefore, overall, addressing chemicals of concern in plastic can address a wide range of SciChem and Global Chemical Outlook issues of concern and vice versa. Next slide. We have also looked into sectors which are priority sectors. So here, when I come from POPs, persistent organic pollutants, and Stockholm Convention, priority sectors are, for example, the electronics, the building sector, and the vehicles, where a range of persistent organic pollutants are used. But also priority sectors are, for example, toys, where often cheap plastic is recycled, and we find these kind of chemicals of concern again. And also, for example, in synthetic textiles, a range of POPs and other hazardous chemicals are used. So we have also one chapter on these kind of priority use sectors, which are useful to have a look at. Next slide. So chemicals of concern in plastic can impact our health and environment. So we are exposed by inhalation of certain plastic additives when they are more volatile. You know, you can smell oven plastics. Then also there is a dermal contact where from plastics additives can be transferred to skin and to the body. And also when you look, for example, to toys, the children often do the mouthing, and so therefore here directly you can have a direct ingestion. The same for food contact materials, where these additives directly can go into the food and then from the food to the humans. Women and children are particularly susceptible to these hazardous chemicals, but men are not spared either. There is a good paper from a study from Kortenkamp from 2022, which showed that the sperm quality is very much impacted by a mixture of plastic additives. So also we are not spared out of this impact. Next slide. Chemicals of concern can be released from plastic along the entire life cycle. This means starting from plastic production. Many of the monomers are cancerogenic chemicals, which can be released if these are not BAT facilities. Then when you produce plastic products and manufacture them, additives can also be released in these manufacturing. During the use of plastics, the additives can be released. It depends on on the type of additives, if they can be easily released or difficult released, or some of the additives also cannot be released. And then important area in the life cycle is the end of life. So here, when we have problematic additives and it goes into recycling, it can come into new products. Flame retardants, POPs can go into toys by recycling, or especially in developing country, an issue is the disposal and the landfill. Often you have their open burning where chemicals can be released when they are quite persistent, or also the long-term release in landfills. Next slide. So regulated plastic additives such as persistent organic pollutants listed in the Stockholm Convention can impact recyclability. Yeah, this we saw in the listing of the Stockholm Convention when we listed the first plastic additive. That was in 2009, the polybrominated diphenyl ether. So at that time, then parties said, oh, wait a moment. So we need to exclude recycling here when we do the listing, because otherwise the recycling might have stopped. So therefore there was an exemption, but the last all other plastic additives are not with a recycling exemption. So therefore here there is a high risk that regulated chemicals can impact negatively the recyclability. Next slide. So we come now to the discussion question, or we do the poll. Yeah, so the discussion question for you is, what are the most pressing issues for you related to chemicals in plastics? And then we would have a look, but also when you have other questions, and would then answer them. Right,
Perfect.
Brenda?
Yeah, thank you so much, Roland. I think this kicks off everything very, very well, shows the relevance of this recent report to the whole global process and to us as people. So the first question here then is, what are the most pressing issues for you related to chemicals and plastics? And while you get thinking about it, I just wanted to go back to our initial poll questions just to see how familiar all of you are with the INC process. Okay. So we have about 10% extremely familiar, and then we have the bulk of people in the middle, sort of very moderately, slightly, and 10% not familiar. So good to see that a range of people in the rooms. I think we need probably some of you who are not all that familiar to come forward with some of your information that may be of assistance to the INC process. So good for you to be aware of it. Thank you for that. I hope that I gave a broad enough set of information to just keep you very up to date and move a few of you who may be moderately or slightly familiar up a notch there to be a little more familiar as we move forward. So thank you for that. Now, as you're aware, this is then an interactive session where we are looking for your comments and your questions in the chat. And in the meantime, what we can do is also just set up a discussion here amongst Roland and Mel, but we really look for you to provide any questions you might have or your comments here in the chat box.
Yeah, but Brenda, what you really see is, most people are not aware of the problem of chemicals in plastic. Yeah, I mean, this we also saw with the Stockholm Convention, because when in 2009 the PBDEs were listed, normally, let's say that input about recyclability normally should have come up in the POP reviewing committee. But and this is a process which is 2-3 years, right? But also during this process, nobody thought about, okay, we have a persistent organic pollutants. It's in the plastic now, it will be restricted globally. So what will happen then with recycling? Yeah. So this came not up in the POP reviewing committee. And then at the conference of parties, then somebody rose that issue, said, okay, but when we now today list the PBDEs, what will be with recycling of plastics from electronics? Yeah. And then other people said, oh, no, I also do not know. And next said also, okay, no, we do not know what happened with that recycling. And then over the conference of party, then finally the parties concluded and said, no, we do not know what will happen with recycling. So therefore, we make an exemption of recycling of the PBDEs. But then other people came and said, oh, but if we do then an exemption for this recycling, what happened then with these POPs which are going into recycling? Yeah. And then the conference of parties and the POP reviewing committee decided that there should be a consultancy which assess what will be the impact by allowing the recycling. Yeah, and by chance, this was my first larger consultancy for the secretariat. with a friend, Alan Watson from Wales. We got that consultancy, and then we did a really deep dive into that topic. And we wrote a 350-page report. But yes, for the UN, you always have to make something quite short one. So therefore, we made one working document on PBDEs, which were 30 pages, and let's say outlined what are the issues. I mean, especially, okay, it goes to children toys, you have that exposure. So we have different studies which show also that when it is in these materials in toys, that the exposure can be at concentrations which are really above the reference dose, for example, from the US EPA. And therefore, from our report, it was then there was then recommendation again back to the Conference of Parties, to not say, okay, we just recycle whatever we want, but that it is recommended to separate those PBDE containing plastics, because that is possible, and from a stream like electrical and electronic equipment, for example, by there's one separation method by floating, and by this we can phase out most of the PBDEs, and by this then finally the Secretariat developed a web guidance with UNIDO and other stakeholders. And then in this guidance, then we describe technologies, how to separate plastics, where you can separate PBDE containing plastics with non-PBDE containing plastics. So that's one thing. And another, I had recently a country, I don't name it, which found out finally that they have a production of chlorinated paraffins, which is another POP. And then we looked, I said to the country, okay, please check for what kind of uses these chlorinated paraffins are used. So they went back to the company, and they came back then, the ministry, and said to me, okay, a part of it is going into food contact materials. And so here they use then the chlorinated paraffins to produce polyethylene, polypropylene packaging, and it was then just as a, in the process of producing that plastic. And then they even produced short-chain chlorinated paraffins, and these short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which are prohibited, they said, no, we are exporting it. We are exporting it to, it was Pakistan, and in Pakistan, it goes into cables. But the company and we afterwards, we took all the different chlorinated paraffin mixtures and we sent it to Japan, to the national laboratory, and they analyzed it. And so this chlorinated paraffin mixture, these were pure short-chain chlorinated paraffins. The company producing the chlorinated paraffins was not aware that these are short-chain chlorinated paraffins, So unbelievable. And I'm sure that the company in Pakistan is also not aware that they are using short-chain chlorinated paraffins to produce their cables. So therefore, I completely understand here in the audience that many of the people had not had a deep dive in this chemicals in plastic issue. So therefore, so I am now checking questions.
Great. So while you read through there for a moment, Roland, maybe I'll just pass over to Mel to provide any perspectives. You've been sitting there, and I think you've had a chance to read through some of the comments. So I just thought I'd hear your perspective, Melanie.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Brenda. I think Roland's intervention was very useful because it provides that background. And in hindsight, it is very surprising that the pop rock didn't discuss recycling of PBDEs. And, I'm involved in this space from a much less scientific perspective than Roland. But I have been involved in this space for a long time, and I'm much more involved in executing projects. And what I've seen is us kind of think about the old POPs and the new POPs, which, as Roland said to me the other day, are not that new anymore. We've had them for a while. And what we knew about new POPs at the start was that they were in industrial processes and products. And I think the game changer with this report that Roland presented on is now we understand what products and how they're in there. So I think what's incredibly useful in this report and what I'd encourage everyone to take a look at is the infographics, because these 10 groups of chemicals with hazardous properties, so far in the Stockholm Convention and POPROC, we look at everything on a chemical by chemical basis. But what this report does is group these into similar hazard classes, so we can start looking at the products, the processes, and things, you know. Short chain chlorinated paraffins actually are probably pretty similar to medium chain ones. So for me, it was incredibly informative reading this report and seeing that the chemicals of concern really are in the plasticizers and in the flame retardants in plastics. And I see a lot of questions in the comments about how do we separate recycling? How do we know? And I think we're still going to have more information on this, and no doubt Roland will come back. But by the time we get to that space, it's very difficult to recycle certain plastics. So we'll talk further about this in my presentation, but we're focusing on specific streams of plastic. I think Roland probably have more comments on this, but at this point, separating plastics is key, because there's, you know, we know PET bottles are safe to recycle, but when you start getting to toys and everything else, then it's becoming very clear that there's a lot of unintended additives, plasticizers, flame retardants in them, and these aren't safe to recycle. So I hope that's useful, Brenda.
Yes.
Back to you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing what I see, yes, reuse and recyclability issues with regards to legacy contaminants within the framework of circular economy EU waste legislation. Yeah, so I agree that the European Union is very active and set a really good frame. There we have, let's say, different layers of issues. First, of course, in Europe, you have the capacity, and you have a good regulatory frame and a good collection frame, for example, and there you can implement this. Yeah, in most of the countries in the world, we do not have a good regulatory frame. We do not have a collection. This was also a comment from before, which said, okay, for the other commenter was, in my opinion, handling and collection is the most important. I completely agree. In the beginning, we need a collection. We need this kind of separation before we can really speak about plastic recycling. Yeah, and before we can speak about looking into chemicals in plastic. Yeah, we see that we have just done a study in Africa and Asia and selected South American countries where we collected recycled pellets. And there we see it's very much informal sector. And the informal sector, I mean, they get what they can get and they sell what they can sell. Yeah. Also, when we look then for what kind of products they sell the recycled plastic, we see, yes, it goes in pellets, but the same plastic also goes into food contact materials. Yeah. So I completely agree. Yes, we need first, yes, the EU is doing very good work on the circularity of plastics. Yeah. So, and there, Brenda, you and the treaty process, I will sure have the aim, let's say, to bring this kind of frame then to the world. Yeah, which is very much needed. But I see also for the EU a problem. So we have legacy chemicals in plastic. Yeah, so here also the EU has challenges, you know, to sort out all those. For example, when we come to chlorinated paraffins, and which are then chlorinated. Yeah, I do not see at the moment a good sorting how you can sort out. For example, PVC, which contain chlorinated paraffins and which do not contain chlorinated paraffins, or when I see now the UV328 stabilizer came as a pop into the convention, this is not halogenated. So it's at the moment, I do not know how we want to find out which of the plastic component contain this UV328 stabilizer. So here also, let's say, for good regulatory frames like for the EU and currently good analytical capacity, I see that also there will be more work to be done to do appropriate separation.
Great, thank you so much, Roland. Maybe just maybe it would
Brenda?
be interesting to comment on data in terms of, I see a lot of messaging about the focus of data at the moment being more at the waste
Yes. Yeah.
stage, lack of monitoring,
Yes.
and the concepts of transparency and traceability. And I think your
Yes.
report touched on that. So maybe you could touch on something like that, Roland.
Yeah, actually, the second presentation will have this as the second question. Yeah, I completely agree that we have a huge problem at the moment about what kind of substance is in the plastic. We had the new listing of the UV 328 and the Decloran Plus at the last conference of parties, and at that time, developing countries urged very much that plastics, because these chemicals, these POPs will be continuously to be produced. And the developing countries have said, oh, but then we need a labeling because, yes, we cannot, let's say, find out because we do not have that capacity. So therefore, yes, I agree that there is a lack of this kind of data. Also here, the European Union try to make this script database, especially for the end-of-life management. But this is also at the very beginning. At the moment, I do not see that we have information which will tell us the life cycle of the additives in plastic also in Europe. So here we are at the very beginning. I know that there is a discussion about it's so-called the product pass, where you put such information, or there is a kind of watermark labeling, other thoughts on the labeling, but here we are really at the very beginning.
Great, thank you so much. I think maybe at this stage it could be interesting, you know, I think this has brought out many, many concepts, and Roland, I like how you ended there in the concept of looking at the life cycle. You know, I think naturally a lot of the comments that come up are about the waste and focus on waste, you know, but looking at this holistically across the life cycle is an extremely important and probably effective way of managing the considerations and impacts related to chemicals and plastics. But maybe at this point, it would be helpful to move over to Melanie for the second question and the background aspects. And Melanie's going to touch on a significant project she's working on and how that links into plastics. So at this stage, I'll just propose to move over to Melanie. Thank you for all the input in the chat. I think it's super interesting, and keep it going. So over to you, Mel.
Thanks. Okay, everyone. So I'm working on the Implementing Sustainable Low and Non-Chemical Development in Small Island Developing States, ISLANDS, project at the moment. So ISLANDS is a global program, and it covers 33 countries, which we'll hear more about. And the global project is the one I run, and that's based at the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership in Geneva. It's called ISLANDS CCKM, so Coordination, Communication, and Knowledge Management. Next slide, please. So ISLANDS, the objectives of the program are to prevent the buildup of chemicals entering SIDS, to safely manage and dispose of existing hazardous chemicals, products, and materials, to manage products entering SIDS throughout their life cycle, and to facilitate SIDS to SIDS learning and sharing of knowledge. Next slide, please. So all of these objectives in ISLANDS inherently link to plastics, because chemicals are building up including in plastic products entering SIDS. We're importing them. The safe management and disposal of existing hazardous products includes plastics that are hazardous because of the chemicals that they contain. And managing products through their life cycle includes chemicals in plastics, as if we don't, these plastics cannot be safely recycled. And this is what we've been discussing in the first session with Roland. So really, this presentation is just going to give you an overview of where we're looking at plastics and in the sorts of activities that we're doing. So this slide shows the projected global environmental benefits of ISLANDS. We do have a plastics target. It's a global environment facility funded program. So we have this plastics target to reduce marine litter by 318,000 tonnes through co-financing under the project. And when we wrote this project, that felt like the only space where we were really working on plastics. But the landscape has shifted, and the landscape shifted partly because of the report that Roland and the team put together, because we've known for a long time that chemicals are in plastics. But when we start to look at this report, we realize just how many chemicals are in plastics, and all of these new POPs we've been considering are contained in plastics. So this presentation is going to not focus at all on the marine litter target of reducing in islands 300,000 tonnes of plastic waste through co-finance activities, but actually on how we're looking at recycling and other issues that contain these hazardous plastics. Next slide, please. So we're working in 33 countries, as I mentioned. It's a little bit hard to see here, but basically they're across the equatorial zone, small island developing states in the Atlantic, Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific regions. Next slide, please. And this is a list of the countries. I see Philip and some other friends here from Ireland, so thanks for joining. Next slide, please. And the role of the CCKM project is to coordinate, communicate, and manage knowledge. And so our job is to develop best practice examples of recycling in SIDS in these key areas where we're looking at recycling hazardous waste, essentially. And this is where plastics comes in. So we're developing best practice guides on what's happening in SIDS in e-waste recycling. As we know, they contain a lot of hazardous plastics. End-of-life vehicles, absolutely filled. The plastics in end-of-life vehicles are filled with flame retardants and other issues. And used oil, which we're coming to understand, may also be containing short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which is not always how we saw used oil, essentially. And our role is to foster, facilitate, and negotiate opportunities for private sector collaboration with SIDS for chemicals and waste management. And this means helping to stimulate recycling in small island developing states. We'll speak more about that a little later in the presentation, but essentially everything's imported into SIDS. Nothing's exported, so that they use just as much, people in SIDS use just as much plastic as everyone else, but they don't make it. And so it's filling landfills and dump sites. So when we designed islands, we realized we had to help stimulate small and medium-sized enterprises to grow the plastics recycling sector, essentially. And our role is also to synthesize, develop, package, manage, and share knowledge on chemicals and waste management in SIDS. Next slide, please. So the knowledge focused, the island's knowledge that we're developing on thematic areas includes end-of-life vehicles. As I mentioned, they contain POPs contaminated plastics in the dashboard and the steering wheel. And what we're doing is surveying SIDS and looking for best practices on managing POPs in plastics and managing end-of-life vehicles generally. What we found is there's very little environmentally sound management of end-of-life vehicles going on across SIDS at the moment. And even the depollution of vehicles, which is standard before you recycle a car, doesn't include any consideration to the POPs containing plastics in the dashboard, the flame retardants in the seats, for example. So we have a lot of work to do educating people that depollution is not just the catalytic converter and it's not just taking out the fluids, but that we also need to be working on understanding that these plastics do contain POPs. We're also working on e-waste. This includes hazardous POPs containing plastics, and we're providing best practice examples and knowledge on e-waste management. And essentially what we're aiming to do in islands is to use this knowledge to increase the amount of e-waste which is safely dismantled and recycled from SIDS. At the moment, there's very little e-waste dismantling happening, but the good news is when it does happen, it's happening manually, and that means we can actually successfully if you do e-waste dismantling manually, there's a real opportunity to separate the hazardous plastics from the other parts. And then also in plastics, we're working on the Tide Turners app. And I bring this up just because we've only recently launched this app, and Guyana Cohen will pop the link to the app in the chat. But one of the key stakeholders in islands is young people. And this is less about chemicals in plastics and more just about plastics. So this app is targeted at young people who might be engaging in the INC process or may just be overwhelmed by the amount of plastics they see around them. And the aim here is to empower young people to change the way they use plastic at home and in their lives. So we've reimagined and gamified essentially this resource that was developed a few years ago by UNEP to engage young people, and it was in a booklet, and we've basically made an app that's downloadable on a mobile device, and we're inviting everyone to download it. So if your organization is working with young people, please feel free to do so. Next slide, please. So the unique challenges we're finding in islands, well, we know that SIDS are import dependent as opposed to manufacturing economies. There are very few SIDS with any recycling infrastructure. There's, some SIDS have a small pyrolysis plant or something like that, and but usually there is no way of recycling any plastics in SIDS. They don't use less plastic, but they don't manufacture it. So everything is imported on ships, essentially. And if you want to recycle anything, because there's no recycling infrastructure, it must be shipped to market. But what we found is more often than not, the cost of shipping is far too high and plastic is sent to dumps and landfills. So what that means essentially is the small recycling industries that exist in SIDS, and they're not usually small or medium-sized enterprises, they're usually micro or small-sized enterprises working on recycling. They limit their activities to things that are naturally more economic, lead-acid batteries, and scrap metal, essentially. And although they know that they can get prices for PET and HDPE on the recycling market, the fluctuating shipping costs mean that this is a barrier, and essentially they don't pick them up and off they go to the dump sites, which are rapidly being filled. So what we're doing at Island CCCM is developing a partnership with shipping companies, which is building off a partnership in the Pacific, which provides free backhaul to small and medium-sized companies wishing to reach recycling markets in Asia or other places around the world. So that's something that we'll be announcing later this year. But essentially what we've found is that SIDS are facing a rising tide of plastic waste, and much of the plastic contains hazardous chemicals. But we don't know that yet. We feel that it's just plastic at the moment, and there is very little information about the hazardous nature of that. With other than the fact that you shouldn't burn it openly, that's generally known. Next slide, please. So I hope that gives a little overview of islands and what we're doing. Just like the community of practice that you're on in the Green Forum for the SciChem project, we also have communities of practice to share information, knowledge and know-how on these key issues. So we've got one on plastics, one on end-of-life vehicles, one on e-waste, one on used oil, one on mercury, and one on gender. And they are being convened under islands, but we do welcome practitioners and people from everywhere to join us. My colleague Cohen is dropping the links into the chat now, so please do join those communities. We frequently have webinars and share information, and we certainly like the opportunity of really bringing together these two communities. Also, Islands has a website, jeffislands.org. Please do check it out. There's lots of information, news, and on the work we're doing there. And that's all from me. Thank you, Brenda.
Great. So as we move into the question, then I just want to thank you, Melanie. I want to also say that SIDS, small islands, developing states, are increasingly showing their voice in the INC process. And as you've pointed out, their unique needs are extremely important. The SIDS are actually represented on the Bureau through Antigua and Barbuda, which is kind of a unique element in this INC Bureau for plastic pollution, which is a nice element for that representation. And we hear strong voices through the coordination group of AOSIS, as well as the Pacific SIDS in the negotiation process. So the more we can connect, that would be important. So I just want to go into what challenges are you finding in managing plastics containing hazardous chemicals, specifically end-of-life vehicles and management of e-waste? So that links into Melanie's project she's describing here. And I think we have a poll here as we also go into question 2. So I see it on the screen. Are recycling facilities available in your country for various types of plastics waste? Please go ahead and answer that question. And it's okay if you're not sure or whether you're an expert there. So the poll question is there.
And
And in the meantime, let's open up. Yeah.
Yeah, there were more questions on this recycling already from before. Maybe we can or I can address. I mean, there's one question: as recycling increases, how do we remove these chemicals from the material flows? Yeah. So I said before, there is this kind of sink flow technologies where you can remove most of these hazardous flame retardants, yeah, from different plastic types, because normally the first step is when you do recycling that you separate between different plastic types. And then, for example, we have separated all the ABS plastic, which is a very valuable plastic. And then you can put this ABS plastic on a kind of a water bath, which contains some salt. And those ABS, which is more heavy, which contains the brominated flame retardants, this will sink. And the normal ABS at a certain density will float. Yeah, so by this, you can separate all ABS which contain PBDEs and other brominated flame retardants from the ABS which does not contain it. Yeah, so this can be done. This is done by full-scale plants in Europe, but it is also done, I know, by informal sector in India. But normally the informal sector in India is doing this then to produce flame retarded plastic. This means also when they get a kind of request, can you give us as an electronic producer some flame retarded plastic? So here then the PBDEs would be also again recycled. But you see also this technology can be used by informal sector. It could also be used in the right way to separate the hazardous ones. And another separation technologies which I consider relatively interesting is the kind of dissolution technology, Creasolve. So here you put the plastics in a solvent, and then it dilutes the whole polymer and also the additives. And afterwards, you can separate the polymer and you can separate the additive. In Europe, there is now the first full-scale plant. It is for the recycling of polystyrene, EPS, XPS, containing hexabromocyclododecan. And so here the industry, the polystyrene industry, but also the bromine industry are working together, because the one industry is interested to get the polystyrene back in a clean way, which can be recycled again. And the bromine industry is interested to get the brominated flame retardant back and to recover the bromine. Yeah. So these are two, let's say, technologies which I find quite interesting. There are many more: infrared spectroscopy, XRF spectroscopy. But this is nitty-gritty and probably for another workshop.
Thanks, Roland. So I just want to, before going back to Melanie here, slowly we're getting some comments in the chat here, so this is great. I just want to go back to the poll for a minute just to see the familiarity. So are recycling facilities available in your country for various types of plastics waste? So maybe Melanie, do you want to comment on the poll results and get things kicked off here? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Brenda. So we see that they're available for some plastics in 46% of countries, not really available in 25%, available for various types in 18%, and 11% of us is not sure. And I think not sure is perfectly reasonable. It's sometimes hard to know. Branko mentioned in response to Roland's intervention that it's all pretty complex, these recycling techniques to take out the chemicals from plastics. And I think that's a very valid reflection, Branko. and pragmatic. And I guess that brings me to a point I wanted to make earlier, which is something I think, Roland, which is in the report, and that's about, can we simplify plastics? Because they're very complex to manage at the end of their life to recycle when they contain 3,000 chemicals of concern. Is there a way to simplify the ingredients in plastics? And then perhaps, Brenda, is are simple plastics something that the treaty can consider, and is that something that countries are talking about?
Yeah, great. Just to touch on that, I think at this stage, the options for the treaty are very open, and certainly many issues are being discussed. So simplification definitely can be something that can be on the table still. Nothing's ruled out. Definitely lots of discussion, more so in the areas of criteria specifically. But I think this connectivity between the different challenges where the content relates to waste and recycling certainly is a huge issue. Yeah. So
yeah, I think
Mel, yeah,
go
ahead.
I just see Percy had a reflection in the chat here, if I may. So he says, in several developing countries, recyclers of e-waste merely dismantle the components and pile up the pots containing plastics, usually unable to get end users for these piled up plastics. And I think that's true, right? We remove the economic fraction of the e-waste and we sell those precious rare earth metals, and then the plastics are left behind. And I'm sure there's a lot of policymakers here on this chat, and as policymakers, we need to start to really look at these additional hazardous waste streams that are the result of very basic recycling facilities, because they also need management. And that's something we're looking at a lot in islands SIDS, and in the SIDS recycling also. That's all from me, Brenda.
Perfect. Thank you, Melanie.
Maybe I can have a addition to this poll. I mentioned that we have looked into different countries in Africa, South America, Asia. And what we found there is actually that many of the plastics are recycled by somebody. Yeah. So this means it is not only, of course, high density polyethylene and the PET are recycled basically in almost all countries, maybe not in the small islands. Yeah. But we found that also many others are, and we have looked to Nigeria. Yeah, we have looked to Chile, to Brazil, to Argentina, to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Thailand. So this means that there are recyclers already specialized. Yeah. So and we have also, there's one good report about Indian recyclers, informal recyclers, which are very, very skillful with simple tools to separate different plastic types. So I think that there is much out there, more out there than you thought in the poll. Yeah, but that really the next step would be to educate them more on these chemicals in plastics. Yeah, to improve a situation.
Thanks, Roland. And I see a few comments coming up in the chat. So I just want to, before I pass over to Mel, I just want to also maybe point out that we see some really interesting things coming up in the discussions for the instrument, particularly when we're looking at some of this end of life and waste issues, that in terms of facilitating a just transition, particularly in the informal waste sector. And I think this might be able to really bring out some considerations of prosperity for those sort of working in some of these more marginalized sectors as well. So I think that's an interesting socioeconomic aspect to add into the mix in the discussions. And then Mel, maybe over to you, as I see a few comments here in the chat before we close out this question and move on to the final one. I'll just give you the last comments here and what's coming up. Go over to you, Melanie.
Thanks. Yeah, I see a great comment from Branko here about actually simplifying plastics is a very difficult thing to do, because all the technical requirements essentially aren't met with simplifying the ingredients, because Branko is making the point that all the chemicals in plastics are there to provide either mechanical, thermal properties and durability. So there's a lot of work to do on this. But when we think about the consequences in the environment afterwards, and the great difficulty in recycling things, I think there is more work to do here. And Brenda, just on the socioeconomic aspect, in islands, we've been working with Fiji as one of our countries, and under a sister project there. Fiji is one of the only islands countries that has a landfill big enough to have waste pickers, essentially. And these people have always been quite stigmatized, but a recent project in Fiji worked with the women who were waste picking and retitled them and gave them t-shirts and other things, and now they're called recycling stewards, and they have a informal recyclers association and access to pricing data on the resources that they're picking out, be it PET, HDP and other things. So I think there is some great socioeconomic benefits coming through these approaches to really changing the way we look at informal workers and making attempts to formalize them into the actual recycling sector.
Great, thank you, Melanie. And then I think maybe on that note, I'm just noting the time here that we need to move to our third question and panel piece. So that's back over to Roland. So I just pass over to Roland to present his final piece here, the background for question 3. So over to you, Roland.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. Yes, for the second part, I thought to show also some options for solutions from our technical report. Next slide. So we have options to address chemicals along the plastic life cycle. Yeah, one is also in the ink. It is discussed to close the plastic tap and to stop some type of plastics. At the same time, we can also think on stopping some of the most hazardous plastic additives. Then sustainable design at the very beginning of the chain of plastics and plastic products, following the life cycle approach, system thinking, and green chemical principles. Promote and develop safe and sustainable alternatives. So this means, yes, chemicals as additives have their function, but often you have for the same function, this means flame retardant, you have 30, 50, 70 different chemicals which where you can select and promote the most green and sustainable. Then also share information. This means more transparency, ensure consumer awareness. I see there also much education backlog. One thing is either the people are completely not aware and they put all type of plastic in the microwave and put their food in, yeah. And then there are the others which throw out all the plastics because they think, okay, now all the plastic is highly toxic, yeah. And I think for both groups, more education is needed, or actually, let's say, to all of the consumers, I mean, including me. Before I developed that plastic reports, I was also not aware how many chemicals are in there, yeah. So where are the more problematic ones, where are the less problematic ones, and so on. And then, of course, there are many options at the end of life. Yeah, so we need to improve recycling globally, and also ensure at the end of life for destruction of the hazardous substances, which I know is quite difficult. In developing countries, there are some CHEF projects which are working on let's say, managing e-waste plastic and destroying them, for example, in cement kilns, or looking also into other technologies. For example, I'm involved in a project in China of which includes end-of-life management. And there we will test different destruction technologies. Next slide. Yes, and as you, Brenda, said, part 3 of the option report from the last Inc. meeting in Paris, has a possible core obligation on banning, phasing out, and or reducing the production, consumption, and use of chemicals and polymers of concern. Yeah, so here the proposal, the option is for regulating chemicals and polymers of concern and to ban, phase out, reduce, or control specific polymers and chemicals of concerns or group of chemicals based on the criteria. Yeah, so this will be a part now of the Inc. process, and I really wish you, Brenda, good progress and the whole team to get a rigid treaty. Next slide. And we have also looked how many of the chemicals of potential concern, this means the 3,200, are at the moment regulated on international level. And for this, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Secretariat has done a study, and they found that from the 3,200, about 128 of the chemicals are at the moment regulated by either the Stockholm Convention, this is in yellow. These are many PFOA-related substances, PFOS-related substances, and all the PBDEs, HBCD, for example. Then some of them are regulated by the Minamata Convention. This means there are also some mercury compounds which are used in plastic, mainly in the production, for example, as catalyst. And also 10 of them are regulated by the Montreal Protocol because they are used here as foaming agents also. But this means that more than 3,000 are not regulated at the moment on international level. Next slide. Yeah, and therefore we have looked into these different, let's say, most problematic groups. Yeah, and we thought that maybe this could be an impact to the plastic treaty. I mean, looking to these 10 different groups. So this will be then Inc. 2, Inc. 3, Inc. 5, and then later in the process. So we hope that we gave here, let's say, a useful basis at least for the discussion. Next slide. And yes, I already said we have normally for the same function many different chemicals or even non-chemical solution. So therefore, substitution of chemicals of concern and assessment of the alternatives to avoid regrettable substitution and to phase in most sustainable alternatives would be a big part of the solution for a better circular economy of plastics. And here I just would like to highlight from Ken Geiser from the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, their substitution approach, a six-step approach. This means first, identify chemicals of concern. So this we have done with our report. Then the second is to select priority uses. This we have also done in our report, where we highlighted, let's say, different priority uses. Then to identify alternatives. This has been partly done by the Stockholm Convention for the listed POPs. Yeah, but this is much work to do in future, but it's also a kind of a beautiful work. And at the same time, you know, when you phase out one chemical, it is an opportunity for companies to produce a better alternative. Then the fourth step is to characterize the alternative, compare the alternatives, score the alternatives, and then after you have scored alternatives, and then you can select the best ones and the top runners to phase in these sustainable alternatives in the design phase of the life cycle of plastics and products containing plastics. Next slide. Yeah, and then the second part of this option part on chemicals and polymers of concern. This is here the Inc. process. Ask for options for increasing transparency. Yeah. So, and for this, I would like to bring the last questions from us. You can go to the next ones. So, what kind of incentives and regulatory frames can be created such that supply chain actors can transfer information regarding chemicals in plastics throughout the plastic life cycle? Yeah. This means from plastic manufacturers to businesses, this means in the supply chain, but also, if possible, to the consumer. Yeah, and finally, it would be important that also the waste manager have this information when it comes to recycling. So therefore, the question to you, what could be done? And I hope there are some people from industry who have good ideas, or from policymakers which have already looked to that question. Yeah, that's from me. And I think we can take from the first comments, because there were 2 comments about transparency and traceability. So here the comments were, with a mandatory transparency and traceability requirement for chemicals and additives in plastic, safe recycling is not possible and safe toxic-free circular economy is not possible. Actually, I do not understand that comment, because I think maybe the person mean without a mandatory transparency and traceability requirement. Yeah, because I think that, let's say, this transparency and traceability is a basis for safe, toxic-free circular economy. Yeah, so for sure we need more transparency and traceability. I mean, maybe the person meant that at the moment, many of the chemicals which we have in plastic have not been completely evaluated for their toxicity. Yeah, and if you have not evaluated the chemicals for their toxicity, then also with a mandatory transparency and traceability requirement, we would not come to a toxic-free circular economy. Yeah, so then I could also agree with that comment. So the first, what we need is a better assessment of many of those chemicals where we have too less data. Yeah, and then when we have really data on the chemicals which are used in plastic, then we could do a transparency and traceability, and by this I think we could reach to a safe, toxic-free circular economy. Then a second comment was the plastic treaty has an important role to play in filling in this important puzzle piece by having an article on transparency and traceability of chemicals in plastic along the full value chain. I completely agree with this comment, and I hope that the industry which is at the table at the plastic treaty can bring in their solution and help in this respect. Okay. Are there
Great. Maybe,
now...
yeah, maybe as we wait for some comments to come in, maybe Melanie, do you want to come in with some perspectives from the Islands project on the information across the supply chain and how that came into your project design and what's coming out of the project? So, and then we'll start collecting a few more comments before we wrap up. Go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. So we, as I've mentioned several times, SIDS import everything, right? So it's very useful to look at what Jack Brown has just put into the chat about the EU digital product passport, because what we're working on in SIDS a lot is essentially some of our colleagues in waste recycling associations are essentially like calling HP and saying, hey, will you take back your computer? And so literally finding end-of-life e-waste, bringing them into recycling centers, and then phoning back to manufacturers in Korea or wherever they've been manufactured. So this idea of having, digital product passports, I think could be particularly useful in countries that are import dependent and really they have no facilities to recycle onshore. They need to send things back. So I think it's great that the EU is doing a digital product passport, and I wonder how that could be brought into, maybe it can be part of the treaty, I'm not sure, but this extended producer responsibility is essential to getting hazardous plastics and e-waste and that sort of thing out of SIDS. For that, I'm sure. I see that Xavier Francois also has a comment, Brenda, on the automotive sector. About being in this IMDS database in the automotive sector. One is, if one is a supplier, you're obliged to declare 100% of the chemical composition, again, getting to traceability and transparency. And certainly from what we've seen in the Islands program, we need that we need both of those things to make further progress, essentially. So I hope that's useful.
Great. Thank you, Mel, for that perspective. Maybe just back over to you, Roland. I see a few more comments trickling in as we finish off
I
here.
mean, one
So
thing
yeah.
is, did we have the last poll about the importance of chemicals in plastic? Yeah, otherwise
Gayan,
we
yeah,
could put now.
sure. Maybe you could put the poll up, Gayan. Great. How relevant do you consider chemicals of concern for a more circular plastic economy? Give you a moment to answer that, and maybe in the meantime, Roland can jump
Yes,
in with any
yeah,
last thoughts.
yeah. So yes, there is one comment from Uwe Blumenstein. Flame retardants are the most tricky additives as their only function is a safety belt, avoiding ignition, allowing more time to escape. All other properties of the plastic must not be altered, like stiffness, color, durability, barrier properties, toughness, and so on. Yeah. So yes, I agree that there the substitution is partly tricky, but I have seen, for example, that there are now for most of the uses also non-halogenated alternatives, for example, and that it can also be substituted, let's say, by other plastics, partly, yeah, which are less flammable, or that by a kind of engineering and design change in electronics, that if the plastic parts have their distance from let's say from the hot parts, that also by this the flammability can be reduced to the extent that flame retardants are not necessary. For example, for televisions, for several years in Europe, I know that televisions have been produced without flame retardants. It depends what kind of standard you are using. If you say that television should not be flammable by itself, this means that the electrics in the television should not be able to ignite the plastic parts. I completely agree. So this you can solve normally by the distance from that hot parts, or by taking a plastic which has a certain there are ignitability indexes. There is then another standard. This is called the candle standard, where a television need to withstand when you put a candle on it, that it does not ignite. Yeah, this is a kind of invention, I mean, of the flame retardant industry, because if with this flammability standard, then almost all plastics need a very high amount of flame retardants. So I think also here there should be a better discussion with the industries, or let's say the electronic industries should speak up what they think, what is needed. I know this is sometimes also lobby work, which has been documented from the flame retardant industry. So here it's also about standard making. Then yes, digital passport we already said.
So maybe while you're going through that, Roland, maybe Gayan could just put up the poll results so you can just read through any final comments there. So the poll results are very telling here of how important people consider chemicals of concern. So maybe Roland, if you want to close out on any last comments in the chat, I see a question there about producer responsibility. Maybe you want to touch on and also the poll.
Yes, I mean, yes, the pool is striking. I would not have expected that this is, let's say, by the audience considered so important, but I also think that it is very important, especially now at the moment. We only have a few regulations and limits, and we already see with the PBDEs that this kind of monitoring and the limit setting is very difficult. At the moment, for example, in the Basel Convention, there are 3 low pop limits proposed: 50 milligram per kilogram, 500 milligram per kilogram, and 1000 milligram per kilogram. If we would put the 50 milligram per kilogram, there would be no recycling of electronics, and the 1000 is quite high. So here, I think also the industry should really be very serious and tell us what they can reach. I think they can easily, or they can reach 300, and that we really can find a common ground. Producer responsibility. yes, I would have wished, or I would wish that more industries, plastic industries, flame retardant industries are supporting this kind of international projects, because at the moment the money comes from some funders, the UN agencies have to implement it, but often we do not see any money from industries in those projects. I think the industry see that they have a problem, the flame retardant industry, but also the plastic producers. And I think that projects, including the industry in developing countries, would be much, much more useful together with the industry. In two respects: one, of course, budget and funding, and on the second aspect, of course, knowledge. Yeah, so
Yeah,
very
great. Thank
welcome.
you. Okay, I thank you so much. What a rich discussion, and thank you all for the input in the chat. I want to move to closing off here because we only have about 4 minutes left. And what I would like to do is just give the panelists an opportunity to respond to a question I have. I think there's been a really nice exchange here in terms of what's being developed under the INC process and the future instrument. So as I go back to my day job working on the convening the INC process, I'd be very interested to hear from all of you participating, and I'll give Melanie and Roland the opportunity to just maybe provide a comment or two on any advice you have for negotiators in the INC process linked to chemicals and plastics, and just maybe some quick reflections, because I think it also helps to summarize our chat today. Also very open to leaving the chat box open for a few minutes for people to provide that advice directly in the chat as well. But we'll close off with Melanie and Roland providing some information just in terms of a quick word of advice on chemicals and plastics in the INC space. So first, let's start with you, Roland, and then we'll let Melanie have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is I said that there is this kind of lobby work, which I think the industry should not do. I think it should be really standard making, should be science-based. So I just put it here in the chat, and I recommend everybody, let's say, to have, this is from the Chicago Tribune. It's a series from about lobbying of flammability standards in the United States. The United States has by far the highest PBDE levels in human milk because of flame retardants, even for children's sleepwear. And I mean, it's crazy. I mean, to put cancerogenic chemicals in children's sleepwear. So here the US has 100 times more PBDEs compared to European and African countries. And I think here, yes, I think if the industries sit together, both the plastic producer industry, the electronic industry, and flame retardant, and let's say the chemical industry contributing chemicals, and find out what is really necessary, and finally also can be finally recycled. Yeah, that would be a big part of the solution. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that word of caution. Yeah, go ahead, Melanie, over to you.
Thanks, Brenda. I think that's a great question to close off on. So what we've, in the first 2 years of Islands and working with our colleagues in SIDS, what we've really come to understand is the impact of being an import-dependent economy and what it means for the end of life of everything. So it's been really wonderful to be here and to be hearing from our friends in Europe about the EU digital passport and these other great initiatives that exist. And I guess in terms of advice to the INC, you mentioned that the treaty is going to have both voluntary and legally binding measures. And I think it sounds like there's some really great, the EU digital passport measures that SIDS would really benefit from. So if the INC process can at all be used to bridge that, to internationalize those measures, even on a voluntary basis, I think that would help SIDS in the very immediate term. So that's all from me. Thanks for great moderation.
Great, thanks, Melanie. I see a comment in the chat from Uwe. It's to be very careful to not use the plastics treaty as a hook to make a new global chemicals regulation beyond Stockholm. PFAS is not only a plastic topic, but a paper, textiles, etc. Therefore, it should be decoupled. Thank you for that. I also want to just point out that we have I presented at the beginning the 12 obligations, and one of them, of course, is linked to chemicals, but I think discussions like this really point out that chemicals are linked to so many of those 12 boxes, and it's an important cross-cutting consideration that I think we all have to keep in mind. Roland, I think I hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I have made the link, between SciChem and the plastic treaty. So there are many interlinks. And then, of course, a SciChem beyond 2020 would be for sure the most appropriate place to address PFAS. Yeah, but we will see, Uwe, also what, let's say, what would be also useful in the plastic treaty. Yeah, and I think there should be a good discussion between all stakeholders.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for participating today. I see it's 3:31, so it's time to wrap up. What I understand is that the Chemicals and Waste Management Community of Practice on the Green Forum will stay open and remains a place for exchange following these discussions. So please stay tuned for that, and that this discussion will be made available online today. Thank you so much, Melanie, Roland, and Gayon, for this very helpful inputs, and thank you for the engagement across. It's very helpful to see these connections and interdisciplinary aspects come forward. So I'd like to close off from here and wish you all a great end of the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Thanks to all participating. Yeah, bye.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.